Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight at Folio. For those of you who are new to Folio, we are an independent nonprofit library and cultural center here at Pike Place Market. And tonight's program is one of many public, cultural, and civic programs hosted here at Folio. You can check out our website for a full list of programs and sign up for our newsletter at folioseattle.org. We have a very exciting program happening tonight. So without further ado, I'm delighted to welcome our own treasurer and today's moderator, Mort and Kondracke, who will introduce tonight's guests.
Hi. Welcome to the fourth panel in the Folio series on the 2020 elections, and a special welcome to Folio members and to those of you who aren't members but appreciate our programs. Please go to our website, folioseattle.org, see what else we do online for now, and join. It's a bargain. This program is, we have a great panel to talk about all of this, how the George Floyd killing, the local and nationwide protests against police conduct, and wider national discussion of race relations, plus President Trump's behavior are all likely to influence the presidential, congressional, Seattle, Washington elections, and policies in the years to come. Our panel is made up of Marilyn Strickland, the 8-year mayor of Tacoma, former president of the Seattle Metropolitan Chamber of Commerce, and now a candidate for Congress in Washington's 10th district.
I was cheering.
Ron Sims, county executive, King County executive from 97 to 09, and deputy secretary of housing and urban development from 09 to 2011. Charles Douglas, former Starbucks marketer and volunteer in numerous causes, who's now what amounts to co-director of Common Power Now, a 2,000 volunteer group working to expand voter turnout in 2020, especially among minorities in and young people in key swing states. And Sandeep Kaushik, fellow board member, Folio board member of mine, who spent 2 years as deputy communications director for Ron Sims, worked in 2 successful Seattle mayoral campaigns and numerous issue battles, and is now a partner at Soundview Strategies, a political and public affairs consulting firm. And he's a close watcher of Seattle politics. So each of the panelists is going to have 5 minutes to address how they think the Floyd killing and the rest will affect the 2020 elections and future policies. And obviously they can't cover everything in 5 minutes. So I asked them each to pick a phase of the question to answer, and then they can comment on each other's statements. I have a bunch of questions to ask in the various phases, and about 8:15 or so, we'll open the discussion to our Zoom audience. You in the Zoom audience can start anytime submitting questions by chat on the Zoom site, and Tess will collate them and read them at the end. But first, I want to ask quick answers to 2 top of the news questions, and we'll come back to them in more depth later. Starting with Marilyn, and then Ron, and then Charles, and then finally Sandeep. What's your reaction to Joe Biden's choice of Kamala Harris as his running mate?
So you can't see it behind me, but I have a Kamala Harris for the People yard sign in my office here. And I was enthusiastic when she decided to run for president. I supported her, helped raise money for her. So I believe that she is the smartest choice and she is the most qualified of the field. And I say this because of what she has done as senator, her experience being the AG of California, and also too, reminding ourselves that we have an election to win as Democrats. And the reason Joe Biden won the primary is because Jim Clyburn delivered South Carolina. And I think sometimes as we talk about politics, we forget that African-American voters are the base of the party, and especially African-American women. And so I am ecstatic. I think it was a good decision for Joe Biden. It was a good decision for the party. And I really believe that this really gives us the best chance to take back the White House and to get this country back on track. So I think it was a great choice. And of course, because I'm a Kamala Harris fan, I'm thrilled.
Yep. Ron?
I was ecstatic, and for a number of reasons. It was important, I think, that Joe Biden send a signal as to what his administration is going to look like. and he picked a highly competent African-American woman and said, this is going to be, and vice presidents and presidents work very closely together. When I was back in Washington, D.C., we reported as deputy secretaries to Vice President Biden and then to President Obama. So I think he is going to organize the government in the same way, which means then that Vice President Harris is going to have the tough job of putting up with deputy secretaries who in fact are the managers of the operations of government. We meet as a group, we make significant decisions, and but she's perfect for it because I think that as a senator, she's used to what we call having no life at all, having to work all day from early in the morning to late in the evening. She's smart as heck. She's really smart, which is really important. But what I love about her is she is not a person you're going to take lightly. A no is a no, and a yes is a yes. So she's a person of firm belief, highly professional, very skilled in the political sphere. So I was just pleased that when he was looking for candidates, I kept thinking, please, Senator Harris, please, that's the one, because I thought of all of the candidates he was looking at, she would be the most catalytic in terms of his campaign, excitement, enthusiasm, because she has every credential you would need. She's untouchable and unassailable.
Okay. Charles?
In January in 2019, I took a last-minute flight out to Oakland. Last minute, it was like a couple nights before decision, out to Oakland on a whim to go and see her announce. It was a day trip, and it was the only time I'd ever done anything like that for anything like politics. Kamala was kind of the dream candidate for me, and she's still close to my heart. And I don't totally agree with all of her policies. And we can get into that a little bit later maybe, but I love what she represents. I love what she means for this country. I love what she means for my daughter, who was just born, who's Black and Asian also. And it's a really, really good sign for where we're headed as a nation. Hope, again.
Sandeep?
Yeah, a couple of thoughts. First of all, not only is she an African-American woman, but she's an Indian-American woman. And, I'm not a big identity politics person, but I will tell you, you can't help but feel a little bit of kind of, ethnic pride or, I came here as an immigrant, as a kid in the late 1960s, and at a time when there were very few Indian Americans, and to see this happen in the course of my lifetime, that you have an Indian American woman running for president, that really would have been inconceivable, I think, to us as a community 30 or 40 years ago. So that's significant. I am a fan of hers. I'm a strong fan of hers for a lot of reasons. I think we can get into it later. I thought her presidential campaign was kind of an ideological train wreck, and in some ways I think she wasn't really she lacked confidence in herself. And so she tried to turn herself into something she wasn't during that presidential campaign. And I think people saw through that. So there's stuff we can talk about there. But I think one other point I will make right now is I do think this year that vice presidential pick is more consequential than it typically is in presidential years. In this sort of pandemic era where it's really difficult to campaign in the traditional ways, and the kind of frenzy of activity that sort of is happening, the conventions, all of that stuff is so muted. So choices like this are magnified in their importance. And I think Biden I agree with the rest of the panel, he made the right pick and a smart pick here. And I think her ability to prosecute the case against Trump is really, and Pence is really going to come to the fore.
Okay, second question.
Mort, can I add one more thing? One more thing on Kamala. Yeah. Young African Americans have an issue with Kamala. I just want to say that. And not everywhere, and it's not across the political spectrum, but she's got some ground to make up there. And I think she can. I think Obama had some ground to make up, and I think he did it. But we got to say she's got some ground to make up with young.
Well, what were they worried about?
What are their issues?
What are their questions about her?
She's a cop. That's what you hear. You know,
Yeah.
She was an AG, and we're going to be talking about this tonight. But you know, BLM movement and a lot of protests are we're targeting cops in different ways, and so she's been connected to that since the beginning of her run.
Yeah.
Maybe fairly or unfairly. It's a truth that she has to fight against, or it's a.
Well, tell them about what I'm not going to get into the details on this, but just tell them what she did after the 2008 crash with the mortgage lending industry. Anyway, so the second big question, quick question, is what's your reaction to Carmen Best's resignation as Seattle Police Chief, Marilyn?
Well, I think that Seattle lost a good leader when there was an opportunity to try and come together and really make some reform when it came to policing. On the other hand, you know, Chief Best was put in a very tough position. And in some cases, I think about the fact that maybe there was no way she was going to win in that situation. You know, she came here into a police department that was under a consent decree. And then the George Floyd murder took place and the city erupted and there were protests. And it was just, I think it was hard for her with the partners she had in both the mayor's office and the city council to find a path forward. And what's interesting about the whole Carmen Best situation is that, you know, I take pride in the fact that she's from Tacoma, like I am. So she went to Lincoln High School. And for her to rise up in the ranks the way she did and serve the public as a police officer and then become its chief, that was a really big deal. And if you go to social media, depending on which platform you see, you have people who are just upset about what happened, especially folks in the African-American community. And often with this preface that says, well, no, she's not perfect, but who is? But we stand by her. And we feel as though what happened to her and the way this thing all transpired was that she was disrespected. She was not treated fairly. And there is I'm not even gonna say a tinge, to a lot of us when we see what happened, especially how she was treated by the city council, it was basically very anti-racist and sexist from primarily a group of women of color. And so it was really, there was a cognitive dissonance for a lot of us to see what happened. But I think that Chief Best had to make the decision that was best for her and her family. And she did what she has to do. And I believe she'll be in a better place down the road. But I was, you know, I'm friends with her. I admired the work that she did. I think she got treated badly, but she, in some ways, was put into a no-win situation. So it's a shame for Seattle. Big loss for them.
So Ron, you were quoted at some length and strength in the Seattle Times, but go ahead. Tell us what you thought.
Being a chief of police is one of the jobs I would never want in my life, because your constituency wants, you know, the people as a whole want people who know how to respond to incidents, a variety of them. They want lower crime rates. If the crime rates go up too high, they complain about the chief. When they're low, they get no credit. They have to hire a diverse group. The technologies now entering police work are complicated and difficult and challenging. What upset me though was that I thought she was not being treated as a police chief by the council, and that made me really angry. They stripped that title from her when they went after her, how much she was getting paid, the way they were talking to her. I've had to deal with, you know, whether it was in King County when we looked at, you know, Sheriff Reichert, or whether was prior to that when we had another chief in Seattle, Pat Fitzsimmons. I've had to deal with them. That's a really difficult job, but they would have never been treated as she was treated, and that made me really angry as a Black person, to be really blunt. And the council can talk to me about all their liberalism until the cows come home, but they did not afford her any respect. They didn't listen to her. They didn't ask her what was going on. And I was very upset about that. I've never ever seen a chief of police treated that poorly, ever, by anyone. And they're going to tell me they're liberal and Ron, you don't understand. I can hear all of that already. But I didn't like how it looked. I didn't like how it felt. I didn't like the anger behind it. I didn't like the derision behind it. I didn't like the suggestion of incompetence. And that she deserved more than that, because she had a tough job. She earned it. She knew her way. She had the skills and she had the abilities, and she wasn't afforded the respect that I would have wanted to see in a council meeting. If you're going to have difficulties, let's make it professional. Let's not make it personal. And they made it personal.
Okay, Charles?
It's making me think of a Malcolm X quote: the most disrespected person in America is the Black woman. I think that this moment in history lost an ally. I think that Carmen could have done a lot of good right where she is, right where she was. I'm a Tacoma native too, and I was proud of her when she rose to that position. It was really sad. It was shocking to see her go. It was a loss. It was a loss for this moment. I think that Seattle is one of those cities that could advance really quickly on some of the concerns brought up by the BLM movement. And Carmen would have been one to kind of help that along in a really, really big way. And I don't know where we go from here. I hope the best for her. I hope she runs for office or something like that in the future. But it was a loss for this moment for sure.
Yep, Sandeep?
Yeah, a couple of thoughts. I do wonder, and I kind of suspect this is the case, that this may be a significant turning point moment in the local politics in the city of Seattle, particularly around around how the city itself is reacting to the protests to some extent, but really the kind of fallout from the protests and what the kind of local ramifications are. And I do, the sort of defund SPD, kind of the anti sort of police, anti-cop sentiment. There's been a lot of momentum behind that in the city, and really it's been a sort of one-sided conversation. And I think Carmen Best's decision to resign under the circumstances that she did, which the other panelists are talking about, where I think she really was treated in a way you could say disrespectfully by some of the city council members. I do wonder whether that is a turning point moment, and that it has larger ramifications in that defund SPD conversation.
You think it'll
leave it at
slow
that.
it down? You think it'll slow it down or change it, flip it?
Yeah. I think it creates a space for a significant portion of the city to say, wait a minute, those kind of loudest sort of activist voices that are pushing for a 50% cut in the SPD budget and a kind of radical change in sort of how we handle public safety in the city, that I think it opens a space for people to say, wait a minute, that's not the right way to go. And now, I mean, I was going to say this in our conversations later, but I think in this city, there's what I would call a kind of progressive center of folks who are largely white, very progressive sort of ideologically, but they are not sort of full-on movement left activist types. They're not sort of particularly kind of radical in their outlook. And those people in this city were deeply affected by the killing of
We're frozen. Somebody's frozen. Everybody's muted. I don't get it.
I'm still here, Mort.
Yeah.
I think the other folks.
I'm still here.
Sandeep, you're frozen, I think. Well, anyway, Sandeep will come back, I assume.
We just lost Sandeep.
Yeah, okay, well, why don't you get him back? So now we're going to go to the 5-minute drill in the same order. So what do you think the effect of the whole thing, the Floyd killing, the peaceful and violent protests, Trump's behavior, the larger discussions of racial inequity, will be on the November elections and the longer issues of national policy? 5 minutes, Marilyn.
So when I think about this, so we're having this conversation in the context of what happened to George Floyd and what has happened since then. And it is the social unrest. It's watching this act of murder unfold before our very eyes in real time and people's response to it. And depending on who you are, people have a different response. But I want to make sure that there are a couple of things that don't get lost in this conversation. Activists have a very important role in social change. It is a necessary voice, and it is often the voice that pushes us forward and makes us do what we need to do. And I want to make sure that we honor that space and that we take care of it. At the same time, what I've heard some people say is that the movement has been hijacked. And so, how do we think about maintaining the space for what the movement is really about, which is about addressing racial inequities and dealing with these incidents of police brutality and in some cases murder. But I still go back to 2014 and the killing of Michael Brown in Ferguson. So here we are today, 6 years later, and that was caught on camera, on phone. And think about how technology now is so commonplace, so that if that happens, it's always on telephone. The actor Will Smith said, "We don't know that the brutality has changed, is that it's just captured on telephone and we see it." And so when I think about this isn't a new topic, but there's something about this happening in this moment that is just built up over time. And we also know when we talk about social unrest, it is about people feeling as though the justice system is unjust. And you will often hear people make the false equivalency of, well, what about Black on Black crime? When someone Black commits a crime and they are arrested, they are prosecuted and punished. And the issue that a lot of people have is that it feels as though there are no consequences, or it's incredibly difficult to actually hold a police officer accountable if they do something very egregious. And we see it happening. And Ron, you know this, it is really hard to prove that police officers have done something wrong. Even with the passage of I-940 in Washington State, we still haven't even set up that independent review board. And so as I think about how we move forward in this is a moment in time where I believe there can be change. And here's why I say this. In 2014, when people said Black Lives Matter, that was a phrase that scared people. And I remember having to explain to people, when someone says Black Lives Matter, your retort, because that's what it is, does not have to be all lives matter. It's not taking anything away from you. It is a sentiment that too many people feel as though Black lives do not matter. That's why that statement is happening. So let's go to 2020 and what happened with George Floyd. Now, when you look at the term Black Lives Matter, it is coming from the largest global corporations in America. It is coming from everyone, every politician, everyone wants to be part of it. And on the one hand, I say that's progress because people are now okay and not afraid to talk about racial inequity. That's progress because I remember when the word diversity was controversial. And so talk about 2014 and Black Lives Matter being a very militant phrase to now everyone talking about it and people issuing statements. And so for me, this is a moment to hold these organizations and people accountable who say, I want to do something about it. Who is on your board? Who's in your senior management team? Are you providing opportunities for people? Are you donating money? Are you willing to pay taxes that are going to help fund things? I mean, there's a whole slew of things we can do. So for me, the moment we're in right now in 2020 is when people say Black Lives Matter, my response is, well, then show me that they do.
Yeah. Ron?
When I was in college, there's a picture of me when I was in college. I had a big fro because I could grow one in those days, and I had my sunglasses. And I was threatening to close down the university. There were not many of us who were African-American students on campus, so we felt alone and ignored. There wasn't any literature or music or anything on the campus that allowed us to think or pursue who we were. We had come to that campus both to be well educated, but also to learn a lot about ourselves. I remember my father when I got home for the weekend before the demonstration, said, I saw you on TV, and was explaining the importance of a college education. And I said, Daddy, I marched with you and Mom downtown to Bar Marché when they weren't hiring African Americans, to Frederick and Nelson when they weren't hiring African Americans. You protest a racist speaker that had come in from Alabama. And my father said, Bud, we'll pay the bail. Well, I got back to college from the weekend with my parents. The school president met with me and the attorney general, a person named Tom Dalglish. And Jim Brooks and Dr. Brooks and Tom Dalglish said, we agree to all your demands. What Tom Dalglish had told Dr. Brooks is there was nothing on campus that would ever encourage an African-American to aspire. There was no literature, nor coursework, nor guests coming in as speakers. There was nothing. We were in Ellensburg, Washington, and we were a digit, but we were not a person. I think Black Lives Matter is restating that again, that people want the ability to say, I worked hard, I have the skills, and they want the opportunities that are presented to others to be presented to them. It is really difficult when you watch other people who are less qualified get the job you applied for. And it's been happening because everybody got comfortable and said, I'm not prejudiced, when all of us have our prejudices. So I like Black Lives Matter. I'm glad that it has surfaced here. I'm glad it's a nationwide movement because it's a reminder of the competency that African Americans bring to a variety of tasks and things that we need to get done. So when but it was interesting how it got taken over. And there was another agenda being set other than the one that was originally announced when people wanted to march. Now, what I think is that Black Lives Matter has incredible opportunities to talk about the fact that African Americans don't live as long. Why don't we live as long? And a lot of that is because of the environment that we're put in. African Americans, even in Seattle, King County, as liberal as it is, are not likely to get the same pay as their white peers. So there's a lot of work to be done, but I call it a lot of opportunity. We are in an area of the country where I think if we do it well in terms of taking Black Lives Matter and the issues that they have raised regarding incarceration, employment, opportunity, education, if we handle those issues really well, we become what I always call a blueprint for other places in the country who are wrestling with these issues, but want to know who did it really well and who did it better. So I look at Black Lives Matter as being catalytic for the changes that I believe need to take place so that we continue to attract talent, provide opportunity for them, pay them incredibly well. And it's not just going to be African Americans who are going to matter. We're going to start realizing that women, people who are handicapped, people from other countries, people who don't speak our English as well, but are more multilingual than we are, that all of us are in this, what I would call a pot that has to be stirred, which Black Lives Matter did, if we want to be a place of absolute excellence. When I was back at HUD, I used to say, oh, wow, if they could only be Seattle, King County. We're going to have people in Congress who are going to say, wow, Pierce County is great. King County is great. And look what we're doing that no one else is. So Black Lives Matter to me is timely, should not be co-opted, but I think can be the movement we need in the business sector, in the education sector, among young people, and the technology fields, to say, it isn't just Black Lives Matter, it is Black lives. Once you resolve and improve the conditions of African Americans, trust me, everything else changes. Everything else gets better.
Yep.
African Americans have always been the ones that were last. So now we're demanding that we're no longer be last. We want to be a part of the whole. And once that takes place, it'll be a lesson for the rest of the United States that be inclusive allows you to move forward with greater strength and greater vitality and greater imagination than being what we call the exclusive racial systems that we have throughout the country. We have a chance to be inclusive. Black Lives Matter is going to give us that chance. They really are. That's how I feel about them.
Charles?
Yeah, I think Your question is what's changed? What
Yeah,
like what is different
yeah,
after
yeah.
George Floyd? And I think the one major thing that's different, and it's different from George Floyd versus you talked about Ferguson.
Yeah.
The one major thing you're coming out of this movement now is that the path to solution is the vote. That's the biggest thing that I see now coming from folks is it's not a march and then figure out what to do. It's a march and let's register people to vote at the march. Let's have voter reg tables at the at the CHOP. Let's have voter reg tables at Umoja Fest or whatever event that we've got that is speaking to the folks that are out here and are angry about the way things are now. The vote is the solution. At Common Power, we saw a massive uptick in involvement immediately following the George Floyd murder. Immediately following the BLM protests, people were ready to go, and it was across generations. We saw a 90% increase in activity from our volunteer base, the largest of which come from the retired community. And then we saw something really unique, which was folks that are my age not have to be convinced that they should do something. Folks are coming to us ready to work to not just vote themselves or learn more about voting on their own, but to reach out to their peers and to advocate for voting. And these are first timers. I was getting text messages from people that I hadn't talked to in years, asking me how to get involved. I was getting people reach out on social media who knew that I'd left Starbucks to do this work, who are asking me, how do I help you? How do I get to work on this? Because the answer to the question of how do we fix this? How do we make Black Lives matter? People realize that the pathway to that is in voting. It's in getting folks to vote. Now, the funny thing about this moment is that I'd said I was a Tacoma native before. I was actually raised by a brother from Louisiana and then Oakland, who grew up as a Black Panther. And so for me, when I saw the protests, the streets started calling to me. And also, I knew that wasn't my lane. I think Mort, in the description for Common Power, you said that we were an activist organization. We're organizers. We're organizers in the civic space, but we are not those folks that are out there beating the pavement, fighting every day in the streets to be heard, for folks to be heard. And maybe it's not done the best way, and maybe there's different ways to be more constructive, but they're fighting for people that haven't been heard, and they were fighting that fight. And I knew that was their part, and then my part was the other side of that coin, which is after we get the attention of the elected officials, after we shine a light on the inequities, and we get folks to wake up and realize that Black Lives matter, that we should stop these killings, that we should fight against this. How we do that is right here with the vote, and that's what Common Power does. It provides a solution, a pathway for folks who are newly awakened to start making phone calls. We can't knock on doors during the pandemic, but we can write letters, we can send texts. Heck, we even tweet at elected officials advocating for vote by mail. This is the way to change, and more regular citizens, young and old, realize that now.
Okay, Sandeep?
Yeah, well, what has changed? I think one of the biggest changes, and perhaps one of the most encouraging changes, is the astonishing rapidity and breadth of the change in attitude in white America.
Yep.
Around, Marilyn touched on this in her comment. Well, we've seen it in the national polling, right? That awareness among white Americans about racism and its reach and its effects and its pernicious impacts has really, shot up by leaps and bounds. I mean, a really significant shift. Now, look, to play, cynic or at least devil's advocate here a little bit, like, some of this stuff, I don't know how much I really believe it. When I see sort of what I would call sort of white wokery, like you know, when I see this sort of Robin DiAngelo kind of white fragility, these sort of ostentatious displays from white people about their anti-racism, you know, and so I sometimes wonder, you know, is that kind of performative stuff really going to move the ball forward for people of color in any way? And I do wonder if that's more about a certain segment of progressive white people needing to differentiate themselves from those other white, deplorable white people, the Trumpists and stuff like that, and kind of use, you know, a little bit using people of color as a, you know, as a way for to psychologically differentiate. So I have some concerns about that some of that stuff is not productive and taking us in a good direction. That said, it's clear that there have been significant changes in the attitudes. And the one other point I would make is when you've looked at how Trump has responded to all of this, and where he's really, I mean, in a crude, ham-handed way, gone back to that kind of early 70s Nixon land kind of playbook of making these kind of very naked, like, you know, he's not subtle, right? Like appeals to sort of white anxiety about, you know, people of color invading your communities or building public housing or what have you. And I don't think that stuff, you know, it's really demonstrating that America has changed. You know, it's not the 1970s anymore, and the suburbs aren't lily white, and
They're not.
And people are not responding to that in, you know, in the ways that it did back then. And I mean, you know, it's contemptible in a lot of ways, but he looks completely out of touch and sort of and not in touch with the moment and what's going on. Anyway, I'll leave it at that.
So I agree that I've looked through all the polls, and you're absolutely right. I'm not gonna repeat them all, but I would note that in 2019, 83% of voters supported universal background checks on all gun sales. 56% supported a ban on semi-automatic assault rifles, but nothing happened. So is there some fear that this could all peter out in some way? Anybody can answer that.
I'll start. You know, it's interesting because America has a really short attention span. And sometimes I worry that we lurch from incident to incident, and then we react and respond, and then it just kind of goes away. And so as I think about what happened with George Floyd, you know, this has to be a sustained effort. And, you know, there's an election coming up, and we have a chance to elect people at all levels of government. And I would say that this is the first time that I can remember where people are being very, very comfortable talking about anti-racism. And not just folks who look like me, but folks across the spectrum. And that's progress in a very weird way, because again, the question becomes, okay, so when you get elected, what are you going to do to address some of these issues around anti-racism? And we know that includes everything from, it's not just the criminal justice system, it's housing, it's education, it's economic opportunity. It's the fact that when slaves were freed after the Civil War, we were promised and denied land grants. But we'll talk about that later. And so as we think about this conversation of, you know, what this means, it has to be a sustained effort, and our political discourse is where this can be sustained. And what I say to some of my friends is like, you know, hold everyone accountable in this conversation. Don't just restrict it to people in our party. It's like, ask that question of people who are running for office across the board, because if we don't make our needs known, then people are not going to care about them. So I would say that it's an opportunity, but it has to be a sustained effort, because this is one of those moments in time where if we do not act, the changes that have been so desperately needed for so long are not going to happen, because again, America has a very short attention span.
Okay. On the issue of policing, how much positive change do you actually see happening? You know, the NRA was heavily responsible for the defeat of gun control, even though huge majorities of the public supported it. Are police unions going to do the same thing with attempts to reform the police system, especially accountability? You know, the police union in Seattle defends anybody who does anything, and then in Minneapolis they're even trying to get the jobs back for the people who killed George Floyd. So they everywhere that I hear about them, they seem to be a bulwark against change. So and most of them have good contracts and stuff. So how can you turn the police unions? Anybody who wants to answer that, Ron?
I'll let Ron take that.
I think that's going to be really difficult. But it's interesting what can change them. Increasingly, police departments are under incredible pressures to hire a much more diverse group than they've ever done before. And it's going to be those officers of color that are going to start raising the issues within the unions about how to respond to communities of color. And I think that we're going to see that increasingly. There's going to be enormous pressures, no matter where you're at in any major metropolitan area. People are going to say, how many officers are African-American, how many are Latino, how many are Asian. They're going to go through that. And then rather than have the Black officers not talk to Latino officers or not talk to the Asian officers, they're going to be meeting as a group because they're going to find out they have a lot in common regarding promotions, regarding disciplinary actions, regarding pay, regarding deployment. So I think you're going to see police departments in major metropolitan areas undergoing their own change. And it's going to be caused in large part by new and younger officers who don't have the old hangups of the old ones. And who know, and I think that we're beginning to see that even in Seattle, where people are beginning to talk who hadn't been formed, realize they had a lot in common, a lot of coalitions within the department. And so I am optimistic about major large departments changing. And once that happens, then you'll start seeing it in smaller departments. I also believe, and we touched on it, a presidential administration actually influences a lot of things statewide and locally. A new Congress with a new attitude changes things. And so what I see is an incredible amount of political momentum demanding that's going to be there and begin to tell jurisdictions, these are the changes that we need to see locally, countywide, and in your state. And so I'm really optimistic about the future because I think we've gone down to the bottom of the barrel. We're going to have to climb out, but I think we have people with the skills to get us out there very quickly, to articulate what the problems are, to be able to articulate what a denied opportunity looks like and feels like. So I think it's going to be a new day. So I'm optimistic about what happens when we have a new president and a new Congress. Because I think we're going to see opportunities to rock and roll, as I would call it. And I wouldn't call it rock and roll. My friends call it rock and roll. I wasn't into rock and roll. I was in R&B. But however, you're going to see a lot of new R&B moves. And that is fundamentally going to change the opportunities for a millennial generation in particular, but it's going to change policing. It's going to change politics. It's going to change healthcare. And people are smart. People realize now in this day and age, technology, you can type it on the phone and say, is an African-American male at my age likely to live longer? And the answer is no. I can look at the data and say, oh, I already beat the odds. I shouldn't have to be beating the odds. The issue is, if you look at how African-American life, just plain how long you're going to live, race should not be a factor in it, but it is. It's a factor in whether you can buy a home. It's a factor in where you can get your health care. I think you have a millennial generation that's sick and tired of saying, I don't like the data. I think they're going to want action. And I think that we're going to see that really soon. Really soon.
Can I speak to that for a second? That action that they want to see, it can't just be national. It has to be local. It has to be direct. It has to be specific legislation. The police behavior is not going to change by them policing themselves. It has to be external influences, and the people are not going to believe, even if the very well-intentioned folks internally have a plan. The people are not going to believe in that plan unless there's something external that's pushing them. There's no patience for it anymore. We've 2014, we have waited years. And before that, before we could even record that this was going on, we've waited generations for this slow incremental change. We're tired of it. We want big change now.
Yeah.
I would agree. Let me take it. Congress always can conditionally fund. That's what we used to call it. They lay out what you have to do to receive the money. So that's where the change is going to come from, because a lot of jurisdictions are going to want that money, but they're going to look at what getting that money entails. And that actually will change a lot of the behavior. So I agree with you, but that's why I say that having that federal money come back with all the things that you want that would result in change, because it's not going to be just Washington State asking for that, or Minnesota for asking for that, or California for asking that, or New York City. I go down the whole list, or Georgia, or Florida. There's going to be a lot of people in that Congress who are going to say, we want that money to flow back, but we also want to tell people how it shall be spent. And then federal government has an incredible apparatus at making sure you spend it as you're supposed to. It's either spend it as it was required or send it back. So I think I look at what I consider to be a new Congress and a new president, and I think we're going to see some dramatic changes. But it'll also require people back here, when that money comes back, to say, oh, excuse us, we know you got the money and we want to be in the room. And that is what I always call community action, so important. But I think there are a lot of people just like you, millennials and young, smart, and ready to rock. And I think that you're going to see changes. The key is, can you handle the rapidity of them? But there are no less, I think, if the trends now that we know politically are going to take place in regards to election, it's going to be called, you're going to have those first 2 years of incredible opportunity to do amazing things. And in closing, I'll give you an example. Nobody talked about climate change until Congress said, here is money that we're going to give you locally to talk about climate change. And then all of a sudden, everybody was a climate change expert. So I think you're going to see that on the criminal justice side, on the domestic policy side, education side, opportunity side, higher ed side, and particularly, are you advancing people of color into those ranks? How are you doing that? And how are they succeeding in it? So that's what I mean about the federal role. I didn't mean to give a speech there, but I just remember being beat up as a county exec on that.
So is the defund the police movement, both in Seattle and around the country, a good thing or a bad thing, politically and substantively? I mean, Minneapolis was actually considering something like abolishing the police department and reconstituting it, but that's been stopped. The New York's mayor wants to shift $1 billion out of the police budget. And Seattle, if I have this right, City Council voted 7-2 to cut $400 million from the police budget. I'm sorry, to cut the $400 million police budget by 50%, and then it backed down. But it still voted 6-1 to cut the force by 100 officers and cut the pay of the command staff, which led to the chief's resignation. But supposedly, you know, the city council wants to establish a Department of Community Safety and shift money from enforcement to mental health and homelessness and crisis intervention. And even Mayor Durkin is proposing a $76 million cut and a hiring freeze. So, but according to FBI statistics in 2018, while overall crime in Seattle was down from the year before by 1%, crime rates were still 126 times above the national average, and violent crime 79%. So how do you defund, cut forces and all of that, and still protect the people who most need protecting, namely minority people? I mean, a lot of the crime happens in minority neighborhoods, and if you cut the police budget, you're going to have fewer cops to protect people. So how does that square?
So can I just jump in real quick? The abolish is very different than defund. Those are, I don't want to conflate the two of those. The other thing is, the defund movement by itself, I think, is different than like defund legislation or whatever happens after that in the details. I think the movement on its own was worth it in every way. I think that energy from the people, I think that, again, the folks who were heard, who hadn't been heard before, I think the pressure from the streets, I think that is important in democracy. It is necessary. So the defund movement was really important. Where that ends up, when the laws are written, when we make the when legislatures make their decisions, that's a totally different thing. And I'm open to kind of the nuances there, but the movement itself was necessary, and it's really, really good that it happened.
Okay. Well, let's talk a little bit about the protests. Give me your assessment of just how violent they were here and what the police response was. There were 14,000 complaints of excessive force and complaints that tear gas was used and bang bombs or whatever you call them and pepper spray and so on. But Chief Best said, these are non-lethal weapons. And if the cops don't have them at their disposal, what are they supposed to do? Just hit people over the head with batons? How violent were things in the autonomous zone, for example, and who was responsible for it? Sandeep?
Well, so a few thoughts about that's a big question you're asking, and there's a lot of different ways to go with that conversation. But so I think one of the things that's really struck me is how we've seen the emergence of two narratives about the protests that have almost nothing in common with each other, kind of stark polar opposites. And on the one hand, there's the kind of right-wing narrative you see on Fox News, from the first day of the CHOP that Seattle had become this, lawless, anarchistic zone where half the city had been taken over by, black-clad anarchists and black militants, and people were being, police were being attacked. And it was kind of ludicrous sort of, caricature of the reality that was on the ground. On the other hand, on the left side of the spectrum, there's been a kind of, everything's hunky-dory. There hasn't been a single thing that went wrong. That CHOP was going along swimmingly, even though there were some shootings, a couple of, teenage black kids were shot and killed, and that there was nothing that ever happened in any of the protests that was at all, violent or problematic and stuff like that. And I find that really disheartening. That on both sides, I find it really hard for people to, hold two simultaneous thoughts in their heads. That these were mostly peaceful protests. There were some actions that were, maybe crossed the line. That said, the police response in many cases was disproportionate and indiscriminate, and exposed that there is much more work that we need to do with big city urban police departments in terms of cultural change, civilianization, and demilitarization. That can all be true at the same time, because it's a complicated thing that we're living through. And so when I see these very kind of reductionist, simplistic narratives light up and people kind of scatter into their sort of tribal bunkers on this stuff, I find that frustrating.
Yeah, but the discussion about cutting police budgets results in, for example, in Seattle, you cut 100 officers, and because of the contract, the officers who are going to get bounced are the brand new diverse officers that Chief Best employed. So, if this defunding process keeps going on, neighborhoods that are beset with crime are going to be less well policed, but that seems to be the way that liberals want to look at it.
So I think just very quickly, because I think Charles made a very important distinction between kind of the push, the sort of protest in the streets, the kind of the call for defunding, and then the kind of sausage making of, you know, how does that get translated into policy? And I think we are at the sausage making stage now in the city of Seattle. And I will tell you, I do think that some of the sort of the calls for a 50% cut, and you know, it's dividing. There's significant divisions in the city on those questions, you know, the activists, you know, there's a segment of the city, maybe about a third of the city, that is sort of all in. They really believe that the police do nothing, you know, that there are sort of a terroristic organization that exists primarily to oppress communities of color, and that we should really be, you know, their rhetoric verges towards a kind of eliminationist rhetoric about cops. On the other hand, there's maybe about 25% of the city that's absolutely now don't cut a single dime from the Seattle Police Department. In fact, we need more cops, and we're going to stand with SPOG, and you know that sort of stuff. And it's where that sort of the 40-odd% in the middle are going to end up going on these questions that I think are going to be determinative. And I think those are people that feel strongly that we need change and we need reform, but they may have qualms more to some of the stuff that you're raising about what are, you know, if we're moved too quickly or without enough thought, or, you know, we're too radical about this, we could end up, you know, setting the cause of public safety back, right? You know, I mean, you know, there's some big experiments we're talking about here, and we better think them through and get them right if we want these efforts to be successful.
I want to add a few comments here.
Yeah.
So, you know, by its very nature, government is resistant to reform. Pick any sector you want. The way it is built, government is resistant to change and reform. And when you even raise it, it is met with suspicion, and people think you're trying to undermine them. So just by its very nature, government does not like reform. So then you layer upon that the institution of law enforcement itself, which has been around for a long time and has done things a certain way. And then you think about the way we consume media right now. It is incredibly easy to find your own confirmation bias, however you want to perceive something. Between social media, the different news channels that say that they're unbiased news, which is not true. And so when you add those two things together, I still believe that reform is going to be possible when it comes to law enforcement, because it's something that communities need to have happen. Now, you know, anecdotally, I've talked to some young people in communities of color, and they've said to me, you know, I've kind of wanted to be a police officer, but I feel embarrassed about it because my friends think it's a horrible profession. And why would I want to do that? And so as we're talking about diversifying our police forces, understand that part of what's happening right now with this need for change is that you have young people of color who thought about it, who feel reticent about getting into that profession, when they in fact can be exactly the type of change and progress that we need. And so how do we address those issues? The other thing I will say though too, we talk about the importance of having government in general, but especially police departments that reflect the communities they serve. And I think that's a good, that's good intention. It should happen. At the same time, the way we train officers at the academy and the culture of law enforcement, in my opinion, doesn't necessarily lend itself to what we hope it will. And some of the examples I use, you know, when Freddie Gray in Baltimore died, those officers who did that to him were people of color. And even with the tragic George Floyd incident, there was a person of color standing by doing nothing. And so I think one of the things that we have to come to terms with as a country is just the culture of policing. And I'm not even blaming anyone for it, but it's a culture that's been created over time. And so how are people being trained at the academy? And let us not forget that there are more guns than people in this country. And you cannot tell me that that fact does not have an impact on how police officers view their roles in communities.
Yep. So how would all of you rate Mayor Durkan's performance, and what do you think her future is? Charles?
You're on mute, Charles.
That's because I knew Mort was going to ask me that. I had to laugh really hard. What is her future? I think she's out. I think my generation is ready to wash our hands of her. Yeah, is she all bad? No. Did she do well with this? No, she didn't. Are there better folks out there who can run the city? Oh, for sure. I think we're pretty certain of that. That is it. It's almost categorical. And you know, whether or not she, this moment chose her, and if, you know, if she deserves the ire from my generation, whether she was painted into a corner or not, it's just she didn't do well. She didn't do well on many fronts. I think she was more conservative at the start than my generation wanted. And this just proved that she's not the one to run the city. Not if you want us sticking around.
Yeah. Sandeep?
Well, so let me preface this by saying I'm hardly an unbiased observer here because, you know, I worked on Mayor Durkin's 2017 campaign, you know, to help to elect her, you know. Look, I think in the early months of these protests, I think the mayor was trying really hard to find a middle ground, a middle pathway, right? Between, you know, in a very complicated situation and with deep divides emerging in the city over some of the aftermath and outcomes. Like I said, I think there is very widespread agreement about principle and about sort of direction and the desire for change. But once you start talking about the specifics of what that looks like and how it happens, divides start to emerge pretty quickly. And I think the mayor, for a while, was trying to find that middle ground. It wasn't working because things were very, very heated in terms of the nightly confrontations between police officers and protesters going on night after night outside the East Precinct, which obviously led to the, you know, emergence of the CHOP and all of that stuff. But I give her a lot of points that she was trying to find a center pathway during that period. And I will say, look, we're headed into a mayor's race in 2021. I don't think some of the people that might be the more, you know, kind of Charles, your generation's, you know, champions are particularly popular either in the city of Seattle, right? Like, so, you know, I think we are divided on a lot of things around these issues. There's a lot of emotion at play. But I, you know, I still think that I guess I guess I think the mayor has started to find her footing over over recent weeks, and you know, we'll see how things play out going forward, right? Look, I think Seattle politics are going to be really bumpy for the next few months. There's a lot of conversations that are going to happen about the 2021 budget, about defunding by 50% SPD, whether that's going to happen or not, about taxation and so on and so forth. And we'll see how all of that plays out and where it shakes out come January when we start a mayor's race. But I would not count Mayor Durkin out or say there's, you know, I just don't think that's right. Like, I don't.
So what is Seattle's future if you have a left-wing city council and Mayor Durkin is replaced by a left-wing mayor? And Charles, is your generation all in favor of Kshama Sawant and her kind of governance?
Maybe more so. And I mean, my generation is not a monolith. I think that I should say that too. There are plenty of folks who are right down the middle. But I think my generation understands that we need big change. We need major change. And we need leaders who are not going to give us that same incremental message. We need big change, and we need people who are charismatic enough to bring people together. If they want to ride the middle, if they want to be centrist, then they need to bring folks together and they need to win people over. It's not going to be somebody who's cold and calculated and conservative in how they address the citizens of this country. They've got to win hearts and minds.
Well, if
Yeah.
you, Marilyn, I mean, you were the president of the Chamber of Commerce. If you get a left-wing mayor and a left-wing council, aren't we going to, they're going to raise taxes already? The businesses are talking about leaving, and that doesn't do any good for the ability to pay for services and stuff. So what's the future like if that develops?
So let me put my mayor's hat on here, because I did that for 8 years and I was the head of the Seattle Chamber for 2, still lived in Tacoma, by the way. And, I think about the fact that in my 8 years as mayor, I knew 6 people who had the title of mayor in Seattle. And this is a conversation about consistent leadership. It's the ability for someone to get elected, to have a vision, to communicate it with the city council, and to have everyone moving in the same direction. And right now, it's just dysfunctional at City Hall in Seattle. Not just between the mayor's office and the city council, but even among the city council themselves. And so when I think about the type of leadership that Seattle desperately needs, it needs a 2-term mayor. It needs someone who's going to create this vision with the city council leadership and say, this is what we want to do together. And finding the ability to give every member of the city council a chance to take a couple of victory laps on some important policy decisions. That's how you have to lead. Now, I can't tell you whether or not, number one, Mayor Durkin even wants to run for re-election. If she does, I think she will be formidable, but she also has an opportunity, but she has to have leadership on the council that understands that the city is going to be better when you work together. But what Seattle has lacked for too long is consistent leadership. Greg Nichols was the last mayor that I knew who served more than 1 term. And when I met him in DC at my first US Conference of Mayors meeting, we were saying goodbye to him. And so as Seattle thinks about what it wants to do moving forward, it really needs to think about visionary leadership, a 2-term mayor who's going to have the ability to work with a council and move the city forward. Now, as a city, Seattle has an embarrassment of riches. There are some challenges that this big city has, but it has a lot of what most cities around the country envy. And so for me, as I think about what Seattle can do is, by the way, it is the big city in this metropolitan region that goes all the way from Thurston County to Snohomish County and in between. And so they have a responsibility to have strong leadership because it affects the entire region. So I don't know if I answered your question, but I just had to get that out there. What Seattle has lacked is consistent visionary leadership that has served more than 1 term.
Okay, so we've got to discuss national politics at some point, because we're gonna go to the audience in about 5 minutes. So Ron, so far as I can see, Biden looks like he's going to win. He's winning in every poll, battleground states. He's on race relations. He beats Trump 2-1, and so on. But you've got Trump playing the race card. I think there's no question about that. And his strategy was anyway to declare in advance that if he doesn't win, he lost by fraud because so many people voted by mail. But he admitted today that he won't agree with the Democrats' COVID bill because it gives money for the Postal Service, which he's cut in order to block mail voting. He said, quote, if they don't have the money, we can't have universal mail-in voting, even though Charles's group was very successful in getting mail-in voting adopted practically all over the country in some form or another. But it looks as though the whole system is going to be thrown into a cauldron because the mail won't get delivered on time. The ballots won't get out. The ballots won't be returned on time. So you could have chaos at the end of the, and Trump has said, he's not necessarily going to, accept the results. So do the Democrats have a strategy to deal with all this? Ron?
Well, I don't think they have a national strategy. My wife was asking me about this today, and I said, there was a time when we went and helped people who were at home doing their ballots. We drove them to the place where they could put their ballots. I think we're going to have to go back to those old days where we're organizing to make sure every single ballot from a Democrat gets to the place it needs to go to be counted. We cannot expect all the former institutions. I mean, they just, the federal government's decided that they don't like ballot boxes, and they're declaring those fraudulent. Some of the states are getting rid of them. So I think it's going to be up to the Democrats and young people to organize themselves and say, my golly, we're not putting up with a person who's decided to undermine our democracy. We are going to make sure that if you voted, if you need to drive to deposit your ballot, fine, we'll do that. If you need somebody to pick it up, we'll do that. I think that's what we're going to start seeing, and I hope we see it really, really soon because we're running out of time. But I think he offers. I was when I read the news, I go, "Wow!" When I was young, I wouldn't have put up with this. It was one of those I wouldn't have. I mean, hold a second. This isn't an issue of how Ron Sims is going to handle the next several years. This is an issue of how my sons and my grandkids what they're going to have. They have so much at stake. If I have to drive, I'll drive. If I have to hold a box outside and say, put your ballot here, I will do that. To me, that's what we have to do now. A new way of getting out and making a difference. If I were a young person, I would organize this because all of a sudden you go from being just a young person to being what we call the players in the adult arena. And the treatment is much different. When I remember at college, when I had my furrow, they treated me as a student until we forced them to treat me differently as students. And I think we're at that stage right now. So I think we have opportunity, but I also don't believe that the things that he is doing, I mean, getting rid of the Postal Service. I mean, wow, now I caught an attitude there. It's going to go, hold a second, it's been around for over 100 years. Our democracies are based on it. And I think there's a lot of people like me who are just getting fed up, who may have actually wanted to support him. But if I'm in a rural area, it means I don't get my mail. I don't get my checks. I don't get anything. So those rural people in those rural areas are going to have a serious attitude. They're going to get those ballots and they're going to say, I want my post office back. So I am kind of optimistic that we're going to see a President Biden and a Vice President Harris. And I think we're going to see good riddance to Donald Trump. In the polls, he's still going down. The issue will be, and what he's attacking is, will the base for Vice President Biden come out and vote? But if they do that, he's the president. If they sit around and moan and groan and complain, we'll have a Trump for another 4 years, and Lord help this country if that's the case. But I don't think that's going to happen. I really don't. I'm optimistic.
Charles, you're in charge of turnout and motivation of all these. How do you think it's going? I mean, is there going to be an overwhelming Democratic vote, and is it going to be well organized? And are all the parts of the party going to support Biden and Harris and show up and overwhelm Trumpies?
Yeah, I was just going to say, Ron was talking about, I mean, he's basically saying it's an advertisement for my organization.
I was
thinking.
Well, we've got a couple of seconds left. Tell us what your organization does and how successful it's been.
Yeah, so we started in 2018, all volunteer led. I started as a volunteer. And it's hundreds of people that traveled around the country. We would fly to these swing states and bring hundreds of volunteers in partnership with local organizations. Now, since COVID, it is entirely remote. We switched entirely remote kind of overnight as soon as COVID hit. And it's all phone calling, it's letter writing, it's emailing and texting. To your point about walking ballots from folks' houses and or driving folks to vote, we have volunteers now that were involved in the Wisconsin election. Folks were on the phone with people, helping them vote by mail. We had a volunteer that had to help a woman who was elderly and blind. And she needed to vote by mail and required 2 witnesses because she couldn't see. And our volunteer walked her through that process. She called her and got a phone call back and walked her through that process. It wasn't quantitative, it was qualitative voter help that we're doing one-to-one. And that's what it's going to take to win.
So what's your prediction about African-American turnout? Is it going to be huge? I mean, and I guess
turnout everywhere.
Harris will
Turnout in the first two weeks of June. So this is right after George Floyd. First 2 weeks of June, I think it was at 1.1 million. And June, all of June in 2016 was like 1.3 or something. Voter registration took a big dip when coronavirus hit, and it was a massive numbers now. Folks, again, they realize the solution is voting. At these protests, there were people that were registering voters. After these protests, there were people that were on social media. My organization was one of them that were saying, hey, are you ready to do something about this? Let's vote. And people are ready everywhere, and swing states around this country, and states that were swing states back when we were talking about swing states in 2018, and states that no one was talking about, like Georgia and Texas, that are now on the table, not just because Trump is shooting himself in the foot, but because voters in those states are activated. In Georgia, they're waiting in line for hours and hours and hours to physically vote in person. It wasn't safe. But they did it anyways. They risked their lives. We're seeing across the country, people are risking their lives to vote. So it's not just, do they have time? Is someone going to watch the kids? My job that I have to worry about standing in this line for 5-7 hours. It's, am I going to catch COVID? Am I going to die? Am I going to bring this home? And folks are willing to risk that to vote this man out of office. Things are very promising for the fall.
So can I make one really quick point? Because look, there's an endless litany of truly profoundly stupid things that come out of Trump's mouth, right, on a almost daily basis. But this is another one, this vote by mail thing, right? Because all, studies and data show that when you vote by mail, it does not have a significant partisan valence to it, right? Like it does increase turnout somewhat, it makes it easier for people to participate. But in a presidential election like this, during a pandemic, it's so obvious we should be voting by mail. And this whole fantasy that he's concocted that somehow this is a Democratic plot to
voter fraud,
skew the electorate, just isn't rooted in reality. Republicans are, if anything, what he's doing is he's suppressing Republican turnout because he's on Fox News all the time telling them voting by mail is not legit and they shouldn't do it, right? So anyway.
Okay, so Tess, we're ready for questions. Do we have any questions?
We have a few questions here, actually.
Okay.
The first question is from Judy. The 14,000 complaint facts keep being repeated. I have heard that the majority of those complaints were about one incident. Can you examine that fact?
I would say that there were a handful of very prominent incidents that did generate, sometimes hundreds of complaints. That said, if you look at a lot of the stuff on social media, the video clips and stuff like that, from my perspective, I think it's hard to miss that there were clearly some cases and more than there should have been of SPD overreaction to the protests. And as I said before, behavior sometimes from cops that seemed disproportionate or indiscriminate. And, you know, there is a process in place in the city of Seattle where that stuff will get investigated. You know, the mayor and others have said that, you know, bad behavior, those who engage in bad behavior will be held accountable. Look, as I said earlier, I also think that there's some behavior on the part of some protesters, you know, that also is highly questionable and doesn't fit the narrative of peaceful protests. And so there were certainly provocations made. That said, SPD is supposed to respond professionally and proportionately, and that did not always happen, I don't think.
Okay. Tess?
I think the
Go ahead.
14,000 complaints thing is like voter fraud. Is there voter fraud? Yeah, you know, there is. It's so minimal though, it's not even worth talking about. It shouldn't be a part of the conversation.
Tess?
Thank you. Our next question is from Lorraine. How will the results of the census, or more specifically, a poor count in urban areas, affect us in the coming years? How is Washington State doing on the census? And then even if we do get a Democratic Congress and president, are we likely to have less federal funding than other areas in the country in the next year?
Who wants to take that?
I will take this. So we have seen specific examples of Donald Trump withholding federal funding from communities that do not favor him. And so as we think about the census and how relevant it is that, you know, this determines how much money comes into social services often. It's everything from senior housing to what we spend on transportation to human services. And so I would say that Washington State has always done a good job of trying to turn people out, but it's hard for people to feel confident about filling out a census if they have a president who is fomenting racism and hate, because people feel scared and they don't trust the system. And so I'm hopeful that we'll have good turnout, but as far as how it affects federal funding, you know, I would say that, you know, leadership in Washington, D.C. starts at the top. And we can have very good members of Congress who want to do the right thing, but the president sets the tone for this nation. And so I am very optimistic about us getting new leadership and having the ability to get this country back on track. But as far as federal funding go, it should be done fairly and it should be done equitably. And the communities that need the most resources should get the most resources, and it shouldn't be based on how a community voted.
Yeah. Well, you know,
Can I respond to that?
Sure.
When I was a Fed, we used census data.
Yep.
It was,
Well, no,
we had to use it.
Well,
Yeah.
that brings what Trump is doing with the census. I mean, the Census Bureau wanted extra time to go into 2021 to finish the census because, you know, going door to door is more difficult. But Trump has cut it short, and so the hardest to reach people, who are probably the people most in need, are not going to get counted. And what the result of that is that you know, he's going to line things up for less money for people who need it. But also, I mean, you could have another decade like the last one, where Republicans, you know, even though they didn't get a majority of the votes in states, controlled the legislature, controlled the congressional delegation, gerrymandered the heck out of the states. So I don't know how you're going to stop that, because he's in charge of the census.
Yeah, I think there's significant cause for concern that we will have significant undercounts in this census, right? It's hard enough to do in the middle of a pandemic, unprecedented pandemic situation, and then when you add on the fact that you know, the president is trying to game the process, it's troubling.
And remember, there was a question about citizenship on there.
Yeah.
Well, it got tossed off because of the courts.
Right. That tells you what his intentions are.
But just the fact that he put that forward, it has one thing's probably has a chilling effect on a lot of people not wanting to participate.
Yeah. Okay, Tess?
Our next question is from an anonymous attendee. After the firing of Carmen Best, will Seattle voters elect a more rational city council?
Look, I think that politically, I will say this is true of the council races. It's been true of the last few mayor's races in the city of Seattle as well. And I worked on the last two mayor's races and on the winning side, that the city's closely divided between what I would call two camps. And one is what I would call sort of left activists. And I think there's a kind of, you know, populist slash activist sort of approach to politics and a style of governance that someone like Mayor McGinn, when he won in 2009, kind of represented that that element of the city and that wing of the city. I think that's a supermajority of the city council kind of represents that sort of approach to politics. And then there's what I would call a kind of, people always say this is a mouthful, but I call it a sort of communitarian progressive kind of, right? There's a sort of left progressive wing or activist progressive wing, and the communitarian progressive wing is, I actually think this goes back all the way to the kind of Japanese and Scandinavian sort of foundational sort of cultural elements of the city, where there's a real, I really noticed how different Seattle's political culture was when I moved here from the East Coast, right? And I was trying to figure it out. What is going on here, man? And it's this communitarian thing that there's this sort of old Seattle view, consensus, process, right? We want to try to, you know, we want to try to make sure we have social cohesion, right? We bring people together, we work things out, everybody's standing and saying kumbaya at the end, right? That older Seattle political tradition, I think, is still, not by much, I think it's still the majority of the city. It's much more, it's incremental. It is, you know, compromise is not a dirty word. It's about kind of focusing on nuts and bolts and getting things done. But there is a rising kind of activist tide, right? Which is a different, it's a more adversarial kind of politics. And it's about, you know, it's good versus evil and those sorts of approaches. And those are the dynamics that play out in our mayor's races now and in our city council races. And so, look, next year we have the two citywide council seats are on the ballot, and we have a mayor's race, and we'll see where they go. You know, I'd be a fool to try to predict. I mean, what I can say is it's going to be a big fight.
I will say
we
this.
haven't talked about.
Go ahead, Ron.
No, just one brief observation about the Seattle City Council from the Kumbaya period. During the Kumbaya period, Seattle was a big town that aspired to be world class. So this is a different city now than it was back in the day. And I jokingly say that the Seattle that I knew when I was at UW is a Seattle from the fabulous Baker Boys. It's a very different city now. And so I think because the city has changed, the politics have changed with it. I'm sorry, Ron, go ahead.
Go ahead.
You know, my dentist is downtown. And so what he talks about is what downtown is now losing. It's the restaurants. He talks about everybody wanting to pick on Amazon, but if Amazon decides to say, we're tired of this, and we can afford to handle the losses that we would incur if we move over to Bellevue or we move to other places that are more amenable to them, Seattle all of a sudden has a downtown that's pretty dead, and it has a real loss of revenues. I've always wondered, you don't create, even when you have differences, you don't create enemies. And this council has decided that there are enemies, and they list them, but those are the enemies that are creating a lot of the revenues that the city is using to operate on. You don't, you know, the old phrase, you don't bite the hand that feeds you. I think that if we don't see them say, hold, slowing down a little bit, and really talking about the need to be more encompassing. Who do you want downtown for a vibrant downtown? People forget what downtown looked like 20 years ago. I remember when it was, you know, it was like with the last people had signs, stores were closing down. There were no restaurant scenes. The Pike Place Market was being turned on its head. I really worry about that coming back again. I want a council that all of a sudden realizes that you have to make your agreements with your business community. You have to serve the public. Otherwise, you're not going to be a world-class city, and people will pass us by. And I worry about that occurring. I think we're really close to the edge right now. If I was doing a business, I would not locate in Seattle. There's a lot of other places, Tacoma. I could locate in Bellevue. I could go up to Everett, because all of them will have the same kinds of transportation issues and services. Residential neighborhoods are going up all over the place in Snohomish County. They're doing the same thing in Tacoma, South King County. So I think I'm a little worried that we need, the council needs to get off its, what I always call the agenda it's on, and begin to talk about what a city needs, who needs to be in the city, who the employer should be. I worry that we have become so ideological that we are discouraging people from, I wouldn't invest here. We're discouraging people from making large sustainable investments inside the city of Seattle itself.
Okay, Tess, do we have anybody else?
Yeah, we have a couple questions left.
Okay,
I'll try to get through them
we'll
quickly.
go a little bit.
Would any of you care to comment on the challenges that a city consisting of a majority white, liberal, affluent population presents to systematic change? It seems that it's all fine and good until white liberals get inconvenienced by changes.
Anybody want to take that?
I think the protests have shown us that there's a lot of white liberals who are willing to inconvenience themselves and put themselves at harm for change, especially for change that will benefit other folks first. I think that's the biggest difference between now and the civil rights movement. I had the privilege of talking with Bob Zellner, who was a civil rights leader, was a part of SNCC, and told stories about being the only white face in a crowd of black bodies that were screaming at the top of their lungs, fighting for justice. And that was a time when the only people that were marching the streets were black people, or the people that were disadvantaged. So this is a major difference. This is a big, big, big difference. And actually, I think there was a point earlier made about white wokeness. I love that. I love white wokeness. Black folks are tired of always having to have this conversation and fight on our own. And it's about damn time that white folks have this conversation amongst themselves, especially in a city like Seattle, where they own a lot of the issues and also a lot of the solutions. So we're happy to be a part of it. We just don't want to be the only ones having the conversation. And I'm glad that we're at the point now where white folks are looking at other white folks talking about how they can improve on race and equality in this city and in this country.
I will just throw it here. Look, I've said this before, but I do think there are some fundamental divides in the city about what direction, how far, how fast, where do we go on some of these big consequential issues, right? And so, you know, what the frustration that some people feel that change isn't moving fast enough, you have other people in the city that are it feels to them like things are rushing headlong, pell-mell, and out of control. You know, I mean, the city is not all in one place on this stuff. And that's why we see the kind of bumpiness in our politics, right? And kind of the frustration is sort of widespread on all sides. Marilyn made this point earlier, like there's some fundamental instability in Seattle politics because we have those big divides about this. And so one side gets into the ascendancy and pushes through, and there's a backlash, and then, you know, the other side. So that's just part of the reality right now of our politics until some of this stuff gets worked out.
I think there's also a reality that understands that some folks wanted to go slower on things like segregation or desegregation or gay marriage. You know, there's incremental change maybe. And we made leaps. And we're in an inflection point in our history, nationally and locally. And this is the time for a leap. And I don't think there's anyone here that would say that the jumps that were made during the civil rights movement were too fast, too far. Nobody would say that.
Right.
And I think it's fair to say that we are again at a moment that requires us to jump. And it is at the discomfort of the people that want us to go slow. And sometimes we go slow, and we've been going slow for a while. Let's go. Let's go fast.
Okay, Tess, one more question.
All right, our last question is from Caroline, and I think, Ron, you may have addressed this a little bit. What role does the private sector have in cultural change and building a vision? Are they not part of the problem?
They are essential to changing the culture. Marilyn,
And,
go ahead.
Yeah.
and
No, it's interesting you say this. I was going to make a comment about the last question, but this is relevant. So, I think about, so much of our conversation is about the city of Seattle, but we live in a region. And there are 12 mega regions in the United States, and we belong in one of them. And so when I think about this conversation of equity, we typically think about it in terms of your identity. But there's a concept for me, this is about geographic equity of resources and opportunity. And so as we're building out our mass transit system, this is a conversation about equity. So at some point, instead of trying to shove every high wage job into downtown Seattle or downtown Bellevue, when are we going to expand opportunity so that the Black and brown people who come to Seattle in low wage jobs have to live elsewhere? And so it's more of an equalizer. So where are some of those high wage jobs coming to Tacoma, to Olympia, to Kent, to Everett? Because I think about this idea of equity and dispersion and how that is actually something that will have an impact on people's livelihoods, their ability to make a decent wage, and how that affects all of us. And so, when I think about equity, it is so tied to where we choose to locate high wage jobs. And if we're building out a transit system and we talk about transit-oriented development so you can live near public transit and not have to own a car, well, where are the high wage jobs that go with that? Because we can't just ring the outer cities with all the warehouses and then put all the high wage jobs inside these city centers, because we live in an entire mega region and it's time for us to behave like that. Did I even answer the question? I just went off on a tangent there.
well, I think we've run out of time, and the audience has been it's been 5 minutes, 8 minutes more patient than they were expected to be. So thank you all thanks to all 4 of you, 5 of you for being panelists. I can't tell you how grateful I am that you're doing this for Folio, and thanks to the audience for being here, for signing up. And do go to the website, folioseattle.org. And if you're not a member, please join. Good night. We will, in September, we're going to do a program on economic policy as a 2020 campaign issue. And I can't tell you who the panelists are yet because it's not fully decided, but it'll be on the website soon. So thank you all very much for being here.